Oklo is, and I say this apologetically, a failed freak at the time of this recording. In the year between the previous video and now, he's been traded by the Raptors to the Kings for the current 15th man in Malachi Richardson. He was then waived, and by the team that at the time looked like it needed young talent the most. From there, he was picked up by the Rockets to ease the losses of Ariza and Bahamute, and Daryl Morey even declared him as a player 0 years away from being 0 years away. He's now playing for their G League affiliate in the Rio Grande Vipers, and he's looking the same as before. There is still a chance for him to get playing time in the league, but he won't reach Giannis levels, and it's a reach for him to even reach average player levels. Even so, the Bruno pick opened the doors for the Raptors to launch their own experimental process, their own version of Moneyball, so to speak. If you haven't watched or read Moneyball and you enjoy statistics and general manager sports stuff, I really recommend it. Basically, it's a story of Oakland's baseball team and the hiring of a manager that was super unorthodox in his methods, and they went on to do pretty big things with a very small budget. The Raptors, however, weren't in the same situation going into the 2014 draft as the A's were in 2000. They had just won 48 games and would go on to do better each season since, but it was basically the same premise. They aren't the most appealing place for a player to go to. Since 2014, the best player that they've signed from free agency is Bismack Biyombo. So the only way for them to get better realistically was through the draft. However, winning 50 games a season doesn't do much for draft position, so they were stuck under draft pick number 20, minus the time they got a top 10 pick from the Knicks.
Is he okay?
He's a Knicks fan.
In order to supplement and complement their core that was already all well and good, Toronto and President Masai Ujiri focused on players that weren't the most refined on offense. The poster boy for this type of thinking is really none other than Bruno. He wasn't even close to being a skilled offensive player. Playing for the Brazilian Pro League before the draft, he didn't even get to the 5-point-a-game mark. Also, these players weren't heard of.
Bruno Caballo.
Bruno was known by next to nobody, but guys chosen after him were also not big names in the slightest. DeLon Wright, drafted 2015, was a college senior from Utah. Jakob Hurdle and Pascal Siakam, both drafted 2016, were international prospects that nobody had ever heard from 2 years prior. And OG Anunoby was a sophomore who tore his ACL 6 months before, in January. Even so, all of these players were selected with defense in mind, except Jakob Hurdle, who was honestly the best pick Toronto could have made in that position, considering that it was the 2016 NBA draft. Bruno, of course, was drafted because of his shooting and physical tools. DeLon Wright was drafted because of his presence on a 26-9 Utes team and recognition by the college game in being its best point guard and one of its best defenders. Pascal was selected for his lankiness and energy, which was noted by many, and OG is a 6'8 forward with the wingspan the same as Bruno's. Only DeLon was what you could call polished. He was the opposite of his other fellow draftees, who you could call raw prospects. Like, really, really raw. I mean, Pascal and Bruno both started playing when they're like 17. And then a few years later, they're playing for professional basketball teams. Man. The only other player that breaks away from the mold of the underdeveloped pickups by Toronto is Fred VanVleet. And man, does that dude have a story. In the same draft that Toronto had the 2 picks to select Hurdle and Siakam, Fred went undrafted. Despite being a player that was pretty much the definition of polished as a college senior that made it to the Final Four and Sweet 16, his below-average height at 5'11", wingspan at like 6 foot, and athleticism, I don't know if he can even dunk, made him a no-go for all 30 teams, except the Raptors. They were willing to offer him an NBA spot after seeing him through training camp, and he began his rise from there. During the 2016-17 season, VanVleet helped to lead the G League Raptors 905 to a championship along with Bruno and Pascal, and very soon became a staple of their NBA rotation. Just the year afterwards, he became the leader for the best bench in the league, christened the Bench Mob, that became famous in Canada. His jumping numbers makes him a serious candidate for most improved in the past 2 years, and increases that included going from 3 points a game to nearly 10, and from 8 minutes to 25. And actually, while we're still on the topic of the Toronto Bench Mob of 2018, I think that this is a pretty good place to note that the lineup from last year had 4 out of its 5 players spending at least some time with the Raptors 905. And none of the players were guys that you could call conventional. The closest thing to it, Jakob Hurdle was traded and is pretty unspectacular on a Spurs team that's struggling at the moment. On the other hand, you have his running man Pascal Siakam, who's on a path that hardly anybody could have expected. Pascal Siakam was born in Douala, Cameroon, with absolutely no love or care for basketball in the slightest. Like all kids in Africa, he was crazy about football. The NBA was, naturally, a place far, far away in a country where just the average American was, and still is, close to fantasy. Pascal hardly didn't ever touch basketball. In fact, he was attending private school or a seminary to become a pastor. The most training he got from birth to age 15 was like an hour of break that he got between classes at school. He described himself later, established in the NBA, as someone alright for not playing. Alright, I'm gonna assume that most of you guys have a friend that's like really good at a sport like football or soccer, but when you're playing basketball with them, they're like not completely trash, but they're not good either. Like, you can tell that they don't play. Now imagine that friend, and imagine him as an African, in Africa, where ball players are like way worse. That's the image that I get when I hear that quote. Basically, dude was saying that he was garbage. He stayed that way too until he was around 16 and decided that he didn't want to become a priest anymore after graduating, and eventually he stumbled across the Lukamba Mute camp with a bunch of friends, and eventually that landed him a spot on the Basketball Without Borders team. Basketball Without Borders is basically a showcase of all of Africa's talented players, where all types of scouts show up in hopes of finding a diamond in the rough. Pascal was that diamond for God's Academy, located in Texas, who offered him a scholarship to play his senior year of high school in America. From there, he played for New Mexico State University, a D1 school, and dominated. He won Conference Player of the Year as a third-year redshirt sophomore, averaging 20 and 11, and declared for the 2016 NBA Draft, where he was picked 27th over a lot of guys, namely Deontay Davis, who was an All-American in high school and one and done at Michigan State. And this was due to his energy and motor and drive to play. He wasn't nearly as polished as other players, and there were questions of his stats just looking good because of playing in a weak Western Athletic Conference, but Toronto went for it. They took a shot at Siakam with the intention of straightening out his game and rounding him out into a player with no weaknesses. He filled that role, and then some. His rookie year saw him thrown into the starting lineup thanks to a preseason injury to Patrick Patterson and subsequent roster shakeup by coach Dwayne Casey. While he started out his NBA career like 4 years after first playing competitively, he held his own on a roster that went 22-12 for the games that he was actually able to start. Granted, he was only playing 18 minutes a game in comparison to Patterson's 30 off the bench, but the experience he got and the later severe pain of being demoted from starter to D-League player pretty much affirmed his desire to become good to prove that he was a quality NBA player. Sure, he hardly didn't play out of garbage time for the rest of the season, but his work ethic and motor that he was drafted for paid off. There are actually a lot of stories that talk about Pascal and his journey to the NBA, and all of them speak on his desire to get better. To become a better distance shooter, he allegedly took an average of at least 500 threes a day. To become a better ball handler, he spent the summer running point guard in NBA scrimmages held at UCLA, and it's paid off. Last season, he became a big part of the 2018 Toronto bench mob. He was and is Toronto's Draymond Green. He can bring the ball up the court, knock down a corner three, guard most any offensive player, run his lanes like crazy, and rebound relentlessly. Rebound. In his place as a role player, he did so to the best of his abilities, and he was rewarded. In order to create the best lineup possible around Kawhi, Lowry, Danny Green, and Serge Ibaka, Pascal was inserted into the final spot due to his game being as complete as it is. Now, he's not just a key factor to the best bench in the league, he's a key factor to the best team, period. And all of that leads to now. Pascal is one of the leading candidates to win the 2019 Most Improved Player award after becoming one of the most essential players for Toronto's core. They're on their way to clinching the Eastern Conference, and Pascal's rise to semi-stardom is a big part of that. He's got a flexibility that allows Toronto to employ a defense and offense that is very hard to beat. He's what you would call a point forward, but at the same time being a hustle player. And instead of calling that a Draymond Green, I think that another name's more appropriate. A cogman. He may not be the biggest piece, but he's a piece essential to making sure the gears all turn. Masai Ujiri and his staff's success over the past few years was through taking an approach that can be hit or miss, by experimenting and by gambling on players that have the potential to fit with your core. It's almost harmless. The worst case scenario would be an outright veteran core and multiple 50-win teams. However, the best case scenario outweighs the worst case by a mile and a half. And that best case scenario is much like the team that they have right now, where a majority of your rotation players were selected 20th or below in the draft, and you have the best record in the NBA. It's a low risk, high reward ordeal, and I applaud Toronto on figuring out the winning formula. So far, Toronto's hit on Fred, DeLon Wright, who's averaging 17 minutes a game, and OG Anunoby, who's showing that he belongs on the list of the league's best defenders after an excellent rookie showing and continued effort this year. Just by watching him, you can tell that he's going to be on the all-defensive list for a long time. And the craziest thing about that is that he's arguably only the third best defender. Norman Powell is still on the jury as to whether or not he's a hit or miss, but Toronto signed him to a $42 million deal after coming off a postseason that saw him getting 25 minutes and 11 points a game. This happened just 2 years after he was drafted 46th in the draft and traded by the Bucks for Gravis Vasquez and a 2017 first rounder, which might just deserve a video of its own. While he has underperformed recently, and that's more an issue of fit as to skill, the promise that he showed before the bench mob still makes him a valuable asset for this Toronto team. There has been plenty of success in the Raptors front office these past 5 years, but they can't hit 100% of the time. Not even the Warriors could have done that. For more info, check out the Warriors series. Bruno still definitely has promise at 22 years old, but that's obviously off the table for a team that's looking to win the championship in the very near future. So he was waived. The guy that was Bruno's companion, also coming from Brazil, in Lucas Nogueira, saw a lot of success in Toronto's 2017 version, playing an average of 19 minutes over 57 games. But now he's playing in Spain for the EuroLeague. DeAndre Daniels was the 37th pick by Toronto in Bruno's draft and was a 6'9" forward with a 7'2" wingspan that could shoot. He became a draft and stash guy who played in Australia in the D-League, but his rights were renounced, however, in 2016. The Raptors, although not perfect, have taken these past 4 years and built something organically, all the while being an incredibly successful team. They were able to take the low picks that they were given and build a core within a core in their roster, something that hasn't been reproduced to the extent of Toronto in any other team in the league. Pascal Siakam's success represents the Raptors' experiments in its entirety, a perfect story for what Toronto's past 4 years have been all about. A foreign kid with next to no skills but all the tools, a motor for the game and aptitude for defense who trained and made his way to starter of the best basketball team in the best basketball league in the world. That's what the front office had in mind when Bruno was drafted, and while it took a few tries to get, the rewards are well worth it. Toronto is the best in the NBA, not only because of its starters, but because of its depth as well, and those qualities are what they earned by going on a little bit different route than everybody else. And different goes a long way in the NBA.